All right, so welcome to the second part of this four-part series where we are going to be looking at obviously stored procedures and functions. In part two of this series, we're going to be specifically looking at the syntax, and we're going to be looking at some real-world examples that we can use, and we're also going to be focusing on the in parameters, okay? So I mentioned there's in, out, and out parameters, but for this particular lesson, we're just going to be focusing on the in parameters. Okay, so let's take a look at a stored procedure and what it looks like. Now, this might be a little bit confusing to a first-time viewer of a stored procedure because you see most likely a new piece of syntax here, and that is this statement called delimiter. Okay, so what the heck is this delimiter doing? You see it here, you see it at the end, and we have this, double $ thing going on, which also appears here. What the heck is going on? Well, in regular old SQL code, like we've been looking at throughout the entire length of this course, we have been using the semicolon as something called a delimiter. I didn't call it a delimiter, but what it is it tells you or tells SQL that this is the end of this particular statement. Okay, we'd always have to put it at the end of our statement so that if we had multiple statements, they could be separated by these semicolons, which are known as delimiters. Well, what happens is, when we create a procedure like we're doing here, we're creating it with a begin and an end statement and putting the code inside between the begin and the end statements. We're creating this stored procedure with a delimiter inside of it. Because, this is fine, this is just one statement, so it wouldn't be a big deal, but if we were to have multiple select statements inside of here, we would need to use delimiters to delimit between them, to tell it that they are done. This is just one statement, and then here's the end of it, and here's the beginning of the next one. If we have another select statement right here, we would need to use the semicolon delimiters. But what happens is, if we were to use those semicolon delimiters, it would sort of break our procedure logic. The procedure would think that because we use a delimiter, it's the end of the procedure, because we started our code to create the start of the procedure, right? We said create procedure, and this is the name of the procedure. And then we said begin, and as soon as we hit the semicolon, it would think we're ending the procedure. Okay, you see how that would sort of think of it that way? So what happens is we need to tell our MySQL server that we want to change the delimiter. The delimiter should be something other than semicolon. So this is sort of a convention to change it to a double $. And so we change the actual delimiter so that MySQL is now looking for this double $, to be the actual delimiter, to say this is the end of the statement. Okay, so we change it, and then we write our procedure. And if we write in the semicolon now, MySQL, as it stands at this moment, now that we've run this statement up here, will not think that this semicolon is a delimiter. So it just keeps on going, okay, until we reach the end of the procedure, and then we hit double $, which is the equivalent of writing a semicolon if we had the delimiter set as what it is normally. So now it realizes that this is the end of the actual procedure, and it terminates everything properly. It's created the procedure, and we changed the delimiter back to being a semicolon. All right, so now that we've talked about the delimiter madness that comes with the procedures, we can actually just look at the procedure itself. So this procedure we're creating, like I said, only does one thing, and that's atypical. You typically have a procedure that does more than one thing in the real world anyway. But obviously for this example, it's not going to get too complex until probably a little bit later on in this tutorial. So all we do is we say create procedure. Okay, nothing big, nothing crazy here. We give it the name. So this one's get transactions over 1,000, and we have the open and close brackets, just like you would if you were creating a method in a typical programming language. This is where the parameters will go, but we don't have any parameters for this one just yet, so we'll see some with examples with actual parameters. And then it's very important that you have a begin and an end. If you don't say begin and end, it will get you a syntax error. You won't be able to compile, and it won't create any procedure for you. So you need to define a beginning and an end for the procedure, and then between the begin and end, this is where we have the actual operations that will happen inside of this particular procedure. So all this one's going to do is just going to select star from transactions where amount is greater than 1,000. All right, pretty simple, very straightforward, no problemo. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and hop over to the my SQL program, and I'm going to create this procedure for you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let me see where my SQL program is. Here it is. So let me go and do that now. So I'm going to say create procedure. And what I'm going to do is at the very top of this, I'm going to have a special statement. I'm going to say drop procedure if exists. And I'm going to say get transactions, what was it called? Get transactions over 1,000. Get transactions over 1,000. So that will actually delete it if it already exists, or if it doesn't, then it just skips this line of code. Now this is important. This is just like when you're creating a view. It's the exact same thing that's going on here. We need to just make sure that if it already exists, you can't say create procedure again if it already exists. It'll give you an error saying, hey, I can't do that. That procedure already exists. Surprise, surprise. So we'll say create procedure, give it the name, make sure we have our open and close brackets for our parameters if we were to have any, begin and end, but remember, I would normally say begin and end and have a semicolon, but that's not what I want to have happen because we don't want this to be to interfere with the actual statements that we're going to be writing on the inside. So when we say select star from transactions where amount is greater than 1,000, we are going to need to put a semicolon in here. Now, I believe this will still compile properly, but it gets a little bit funky if you have a bunch of different statements inside of here, because what will happen is if I had like another select statement and a whole bunch of other things going on, remember these procedures can get very, very long. You can get to the point where you have, hundreds if not thousands of lines of code inside of a procedure. And if you have not changed the delimiter, it could screw things up in terms of how the actual procedure functions if you don't change that delimiter, okay? So it won't be evident right now. I'm sure I can run this right now and it will compile if I run it. See, it does compile properly, but just take a word for it. It can give you some really wonky results if you don't change that delimiter. So that's kind of a bit of a gotcha inside of MySQL and creating stored procedures, okay? And stored functions for that matter. So I'm gonna remember to change the delimiter. Delimiter is now changed to, I'll just do $. Another thing that's a convention is to do the double backslash or forward slash. I've seen that before as well, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. You can choose whatever delimiter you like. I'm going to choose double $, and then change my final one instead of being a semicolon to be a double $, as well. And then I will also remember to change it back. Okay, because some strange things can happen if we don't change our delimiter back at the end of a stored procedure. Okay. So now this is going to run from top to bottom. So you see here the first line it runs is this one. And as you can see in this first line, we have not changed the delimiter at all. So it's okay to use the semicolon here. And then on the second line, we change the delimiter. So from the here on down, this double $, will mean that that it's the termination of the statement. So then it goes down, it goes through these lines of codes, it hits the semicolon and just treats it as any other character, and then it hits the end and says, okay, boom, now I have hit the delimiter, so I'm at the end of this particular statement, so it terminates it, and then we have a nice procedure created with the proper delimiters inside being treated properly within their own rights, I suppose. And then, of course, we remember to change the delimiter back. So now if I were to run this, you see that it executes successfully as well. We've created this procedure, and now let's say you want to use it. Now, I'm going to tell you I'm going to have the code, rather, on how to use these procedures as well as functions at the end of the slides for reference sake, but for now, I'm going to tell you how to execute these things right now, these routines. So how you execute your routine, or rather your procedure, because that's what we're executing right now, is via the call keyword. So you say call to call a procedure, and then you pass in the name of the procedure itself. Okay, so you give it the procedure, and then you can use your delimiter as normal. And if I were to hover over this, or rather select it and then run it, so I'll hit F5, then there we go, we get our result. So it returns one transaction because only one is over the amount of $1,000 in our database. So Very good. So it just runs the select statement that we have defined inside of there. So that's really cool. Another way you can do it is if you want, you can include the brackets. I did not include the brackets this time, or the curly braces or whatever you want to call, or not the curly braces. These are parentheses. There we go. I did not include the parentheses because I didn't have any parameters, so I didn't need them. But I mean, if you want to include them as well, I can hit F5 and run this, and it runs just fine as well. There's no problems with it. There will only be a problem if there are parameters defined inside of these parentheses and you have not yet and you did not use them here. Then it'll give you it should give you an error. Okay, so excellent. Let's move back to the presentation slides, which should be right here. Yes. So let's go to the next, I guess, slide. So you can use using parameters. So this is, I guess, what we're going to be talking about now, parameters. Since I was just talking about them then, it makes perfect sense to continue. You can obviously also use parameters with stored procedures and functions, just like in programming. In MySQL, you need to define not only the parameter's name and type, but also sort of how it's used within the procedure or function itself, which is kind of different. If you're coming from a programming background, you might not be familiar with this. So in MySQL, you need to let MySQL know if it's going to be used as an in or an out parameter. Now, this really confused me back in the day when I was learning how to do this stuff, because I just couldn't wrap my head around why I needed to tell it if it's an in or an out parameter and how to use these things. So it's just very confusing to me. But, I mean, once you really understand it and learn it, you're like, well, why the heck was I so confused about it? Because it really isn't that complex. So, again, maybe that's just because I didn't have a good teacher at the time. Maybe he glossed over it very quickly. But I will not make that same mistake with you guys. I'm going to go into detail about this stuff and show you some examples of both. So, in and out parameters. An in parameter, starting with that one first, an in parameter is one that you're probably already familiar with if you have a programming background. Okay, it's used as a value that's passed into the procedure and used within the operations inside of the procedure. Okay, it's passed into it and used inside of it, and that's why it's called an in parameter. Okay, you pass it in and use it inside of the actual procedure. In contrast, there's an out parameter. An out parameter is used to store data from the stored procedure and then used outside of the stored procedure. Okay, the purpose of the out parameter is to like I said, to store data, to have data stored within it. Okay, it's like a variable, but then the variable is used outside of the scope of the procedure. Okay, whereas the in parameter is only used within the procedure itself, and the code or the database itself will have no knowledge of this particular parameter outside of the procedure or function. It won't have any idea what the heck is going on, whereas the out parameter can be referred to outside of the procedure itself. Okay, now the out parameter gets a little bit tricky with functions, but we'll get there in a moment. I don't want to confuse you just yet. So now to throw you a little bit of a curveball, there's even something called an in-out parameter. So that's in-out spelled all together as one word. And an in-out parameter is exactly what it sounds like. It combines both the functionality of the in parameter as well as the out parameter. So you can use it to pass data into the procedure itself, and then also use that exact same variable, that exact same parameter, as one that can be passed back out and used outside of the scope of your procedure. Okay, cool. So let's take a look at what a stored procedure looks like with an in parameter. All right, so I'm going to introduce obviously the parameter itself. So as you can see, this is what the parameter looks like here, the transaction date. So first, let me talk about what this procedure is. So this procedure is called get transactions greater than date. So the date it's referring to is the date that I'm passing in as an in parameter. So we're saying get transactions greater than some date that we're passing in. Again, the name of it obviously doesn't matter in terms of the functionality of this procedure. I just like to choose a name that sort of gives you an idea as someone coming in from the outside, gives them an idea of what the heck this procedure does. It's always a good convention to give it a good name that sort of gives you an idea of what the procedure does. All right, you don't want to just name your procedures, A or X or Y. Okay, because that doesn't give me any idea of what the heck this procedure is doing if it's just named X. So be sure to give it a nice name so other people will understand what this thing does. So I want to get transactions greater than some date that we pass in. So then we define it as an in parameter because we want to use this as an in parameter. We don't care about using this transaction date outside of this procedure because we don't really care. We don't really need to know about it. We want to just get the data returned as a result of using the transaction date being passed in inside of our logic. Okay, so having said that, let's take a look at what happens. So we just say select star from transactions where transaction date is greater than, and then we use the name of the parameter that we have passed in, which is called the transaction date. All right. When you use, for the first time I did this, I used the name transaction date as well for the in parameter because that's something that I can do. I come from a Java programming background. That's something that you can do with a Java inside the Java programming language, sort of. So I thought maybe I can get away with it here, but you definitely cannot. So you want to choose a unique name that is obviously unique to this parameter versus anything else that you're using inside of your, potentially inside of your select statements. So these two names are different, and they're different for a reason. Because if they're the same, it doesn't work. I learned that the hard way. So there you go. This is how you would do that. Now let me go to the next slide and see. Okay, no, I don't want to go to the next slide just yet. Now I want to actually create this procedure for you inside of our SQL or MySQL server. So let's change this around. Let's say get transactions. What did I say? Greater than date, I think it was called. Get transactions greater than date. So get transactions. Let me just change this one to say greater than date, and I will copy paste it in here, and then let me delete that for now, and let me change this to be that. Okay, so now just starting from almost a scratch position. So now create procedure, get transactions greater than date, but remember we're using an in parameter this time. So I'm going to define an in parameter. I'm going to call it the transaction date, and then I need to specify the actual type for this parameter. So what's the type? It's going to be just a date type. It could be a date time as well if you like, but for this one, for the sake of this, I'm just going to say date. So then I can say, okay, great. So that's being passed in as an in parameter. I'm going to begin my procedure, and I'm going to say select star from transactions where transaction date is greater than the transaction date, and I'm going to end it with my regular old plain delimiter of a semicolon. Okay, so fantastic. I'm going to run this now, and hopefully it should execute successfully. Good, I don't see any errors. I'll clear my console, and then I'm going to go and actually let me move this console up a bit so that it's a lot easier for us so I don't have to keep scrolling up and down. So then I can actually call this procedure. Again, remember, when we're executing procedures, we use the keyword call. So I'm going to call the procedure, but remember now, I need to include a parameter. If I don't, I believe I will hit an error. So let me hit the run button, and sure enough, it says incorrect number of arguments for the procedure, blah, blah, blah. So I need to remember to include the in variable or the in parameter, which in this case I'll just put it in as today's date, which is 2014 October, what are we, 12th. Okay, so then I'll run this, and sure enough, there we go. So now we get all the transactions inside of the transactions table with a date greater than the one that we have just passed in. Okay, which in this case gives us about 136,000 rows of data. Very, very cool. Very handy to be able to use these parameters. Okay, it gives you a real good, flexible way to create procedures that are dynamic and that you can have them do pretty much whatever the heck you want them to do. Cool. So that'll finish up this particular episode in our 4-part series. So for now, I will bid you adieu, and we will see you in part 3, where we're going to be starting to look at some more stored procs with if statements. So we're looking at control structure type stuff, as well as the in and out parameters. So I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye for now.